What most Americans don't realize is that this aluminum crisis didn't begin with a shortage, it began with arrogance. The assumption that economic pressure automatically translates into compliance, that neighbors will absorb punishment indefinitely, and that markets bend to political will rather than mathematical reality. When I look at what happened to American aluminum supplies over the past 18 months, I see something far more revealing than a trade dispute. I see the institutional failure of a political class that confused leverage with power and mistook disruption for strategy. The public story sounds familiar because it follows a script we've heard countless times. American leadership imposes steep tariffs on aluminum imports, officially to protect domestic industry and strengthen national security. The rhetoric emphasizes self-sufficiency, economic sovereignty, and the restoration of manufacturing jobs. Critics warn of higher costs and retaliation. Supporters promise short-term pain for long-term gain, and the policy moves forward with the confidence that America's economic gravity will eventually pull resistant partners back into line. For a brief moment, that narrative seemed to hold. Aluminum stockpiles masked the immediate impact. Domestic prices rose, but gradually, Canadian producers initially absorbed some of the costs while exploring their options. The tariff appeared to be working as intended, creating space for American smelters to expand and forcing foreign competitors to accept reduced market share. Political leaders declared victory, pointing to early signs of domestic investment and dismissing warnings about retaliation as the predictable complaints of globalist interests resistant to America First policies. What the public didn't see was the foundation quietly eroding beneath this apparent success. American aluminum production had been declining for decades, not because of unfair competition, but because of basic economics. Smelting aluminum requires enormous amounts of electricity, and American energy costs had made domestic production increasingly uncompetitive. The infrastructure that once supported a robust aluminum industry had been allowed to decay, sold off, or repurposed. Skilled workers had moved to other industries. The supply chains that connected raw materials to finished products had been reconfigured around imports, particularly from Canada, where abundant hydroelectric power made production far more economically viable. When tariffs suddenly made Canadian aluminum more expensive, American buyers didn't rush to embrace domestic alternatives because those alternatives largely didn't exist at the scale needed. Instead, they did what any rational economic actor does under uncertainty. They drew down existing stockpiles while hoping the disruption would prove temporary. This created the illusion of policy success while actually accelerating toward crisis. Every ton of aluminum pulled from reserves was a ton that wouldn't be available when those reserves finally emptied. The institutional reality that political leaders either ignored or genuinely misunderstood was that modern supply chains are not switches you can flip on command. They are systems built over years through countless decisions about cost, reliability, and risk. When those systems are disrupted suddenly, they don't snap back into a previous configuration. They adapt. And adaptation in a globalized economy usually means moving around obstacles rather than accommodating them. Canadian aluminum producers understood this logic immediately. Faced with punitive American tariffs and an increasingly unpredictable policy environment, they began redirecting shipments to European markets that offered both stable demand and predictable rules. This wasn't retaliation in the dramatic sense Americans had come to expect from trade disputes. There were no angry speeches, no threats of economic warfare, no dramatic announcements. There was simply a quiet recalculation of where aluminum could be sold most profitably with the least political risk. European buyers, already concerned about supply chain vulnerability and eager to reduce dependence on Chinese aluminum, welcomed Canadian producers with open arms. Trade agreements were already in place. Quality standards were easily met. The infrastructure for transporting and processing Canadian aluminum was quickly established. Within months, what had been a relatively minor trade relationship became a significant economic partnership, while the North American aluminum trade that had operated smoothly for decades began to fragment. The first American companies to feel the impact were those with the least flexibility, smaller manufacturers who couldn't absorb sudden cost increases and lacked the global reach to source materials elsewhere. When aluminum prices began climbing steadily, then sharply, these firms faced an impossible choice. They could raise prices and lose customers, absorb costs and sacrifice profitability, or reduce production and lay off workers. Many tried all three strategies sequentially, hoping the crisis would resolve before any single approach proved fatal. Larger corporations with more resources initially managed the situation through financial instruments and existing contracts, but even their buffers had limits. As aluminum prices reached levels not seen in over a decade, CFOs, who had dismissed the tariffs as a manageable expense, began restructuring operations around scarcity rather than abundance. Projects were delayed, expansion plans were shelved, and long-term investments were redirected toward regions where input costs remained predictable. The automobile industry, which had been promised that tariffs would strengthen American manufacturing, found itself caught in a particularly cruel irony. Higher aluminum costs made domestic vehicle production more expensive, just as tariffs on finished automobiles were supposed to make it more competitive. Instead of reshoring production, several major automakers began exploring ways to source aluminum components from their overseas facilities, effectively using their own global supply chains to bypass the very policy intended to strengthen American manufacturing. What I find most revealing about this sequence of events is how completely it vindicated every principle of institutional conservatism that the architects of this policy claimed to champion. Markets do respond to incentives, but they respond to all incentives, including the incentive to avoid unpredictable policy environments. Alliances do matter, but they matter most when one partner can offer stability that the other cannot. Economic sovereignty is indeed valuable, but it cannot be achieved through wishful thinking or political pressure alone. Canada's response to this situation exemplifies the kind of strategic patience that American leadership has largely abandoned. Rather than matching escalation with escalation, Canadian officials quietly diversified their economy away from dependence on American demand. They strengthened relationships with European partners, expanded trade ties with Asian markets, and invested in infrastructure that reduced their vulnerability to sudden policy shifts from any single partner. This wasn't dramatic enough to generate headlines, but it was effective enough to fundamentally alter the balance of leverage in North American trade. The strategic consequences of this shift extend far beyond aluminum prices, significant as those have become. When reserves finally emptied and American buyers confronted the full cost of their isolation, the damage wasn't limited to higher input costs. It included the recognition that decades of economic integration could be unraveled far more quickly than they could be rebuilt, and that the assumption of American indispensability had been quietly tested and found wanting. Canadian aluminum producers who once treated the American market as their primary destination now view it as one option among several and not necessarily the most attractive one. European buyers who discovered Canadian reliability during this crisis have no particular incentive to abandon those relationships if American policy eventually moderates. The infrastructure built to support transatlantic aluminum trade won't simply disappear if tariffs are reduced. These are the kinds of structural changes that outlast the political circumstances that created them. For American consumers, the aluminum crisis translates into higher costs for everything from automobiles to appliances to construction materials. These aren't abstract price increases that appear in economic data. They are real expenses that show up in household budgets, business planning, and community development projects. When the cost of building materials rises sharply, housing becomes less affordable. When automotive components become more expensive, vehicle prices increase. When packaging costs spike, food prices follow. The aluminum tariff has effectively become a tax on American economic activity, imposed not by Congress, but by the unintended consequences of policy that prioritized political theater over economic logic. The broader lesson here concerns the institutional memory that American leadership has systematically abandoned over the past decade. Trade policy used to be understood as a long-term strategic exercise, requiring careful coordination between economic objectives and diplomatic relationships. It was managed by professionals who understood that actions have consequences, that partners have alternatives, and that short-term tactical gains often come at the expense of long-term strategic position. What replaced that institutional approach was a more impulsive style that treated trade policy as an extension of campaign rhetoric rather than a tool of statecraft. Complex economic relationships were reduced to simple narratives about winners and losers. Negotiating partners were treated as adversaries to be coerced rather than allies to be coordinated with. The assumption seemed to be that American economic power was so overwhelming that others would simply absorb whatever pressure was applied and return to previous patterns of cooperation once they had been sufficiently chastened. The aluminum crisis demonstrates the fatal flaw in this approach. Economic power, like military power, is most effective when it doesn't have to be used. Once you begin weaponizing economic relationships, you force partners to develop alternatives to your weaponization. The more successful you are at imposing short-term costs, the stronger the incentive becomes for others to reduce their long-term dependence on your cooperation. Canada's pivot toward European aluminum markets is a textbook example of this dynamic in operation. What makes this particularly damaging to American interests is that it represents a pattern rather than an isolated incident. When trade policy becomes unpredictable, investment flows toward more stable alternatives. When alliance relationships are treated as transactional, partners begin hedging their strategic commitments. When economic cooperation is subordinated to political grandstanding, the foundations of prosperity that took generations to build can erode with surprising speed. The aluminum shortage that American industry now confronts is not primarily about geology or technology. The United States has the resources and technical capability to produce aluminum domestically if it chooses to make the necessary investments. What it lacks is the political patience to build sustainable competitive advantages rather than seeking immediate tactical victories. Rebuilding aluminum smelting capacity would require years of planning, billions of dollars in infrastructure investment, and policy consistency across multiple electoral cycles. It would require exactly the kind of long-term institutional commitment that the current approach to trade policy systematically undermines. The irony is that the policy tools needed to strengthen American aluminum production were available without imposing tariffs that alienated the country's most reliable supplier. Energy policy that reduced electricity costs for industrial users, infrastructure investment that improved transportation efficiency, and trade policy that secured reliable access to raw materials could have enhanced American competitiveness without forcing Canadian producers to seek alternative markets. Instead, the preference for dramatic gestures over patient institution building has left American manufacturers more vulnerable than they were before the policy intervention began. When I consider the longer-term implications of this episode, what concerns me most is not the immediate economic damage, significant as that has proven to be. What concerns me is the demonstration that American policy can no longer be counted on to serve American interests when those interests conflict with short-term political calculations. Allies and competitors alike are drawing conclusions from the aluminum crisis that will shape their strategic planning for years to come. Canada has learned that economic integration with the United States carries political risks that must be managed through diversification and strategic hedging. European governments have learned that North American supply chains can be disrupted suddenly and that alternative partnerships offer both economic opportunities and political advantages. American manufacturers have learned that their own government may be a greater source of uncertainty than foreign competition or natural disasters. These lessons don't disappear when administrations change or when policies are reversed. They become embedded in the institutional memory of governments and corporations that have been forced to adapt to American unpredictability. The result is a gradual but persistent erosion of the economic relationships that have underpinned American prosperity since the end of World War II. The aluminum crisis will eventually resolve. Market forces will eventually rebalance supply and demand, though at price levels significantly higher than prevailed before the disruption began. Some American aluminum production may eventually restart, though the economics will remain challenging without sustained policy support. Some Canadian producers may eventually return to serving American customers, though probably not with the same priority or commitment they once demonstrated. What won't be easily restored is the assumption that economic integration with the United States offers partners stability, predictability, and mutual benefit. Once that assumption is broken, it must be earned back through demonstrated reliability over extended periods. History suggests that such institutional trust, once lost, is far more difficult to rebuild than it was to destroy. This is the real cost of the aluminum crisis, not just higher prices or supply disruptions, but the revelation that American leadership no longer understands the difference between power and influence, between tactics and strategy, between winning an argument and advancing interests. Until that understanding is restored, we can expect more episodes like this one, each further eroding the foundations of prosperity that previous generations of American leaders worked so carefully to construct.